Welcome to TIABC's Voice of Tourism podcast, where we discuss issues that affect the visitor economy with subject matter experts representing private businesses, sector associations, destination management organizations, post-secondary institutions, all levels of government, and other stakeholders. I'm Walt Judas, CEO of the Tourism Industry Association of British Columbia, an advocacy organization that works on behalf of its members to influence government policy and direction. My guest today is Matt Jennings, Executive Director of the BC Fishing Tourism Association. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining me on the Voice of Tourism.
Thanks for having me, Walt. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to begin by asking you a bit about your life and your career. You were raised in a small community called Little Fort. For those that don't know about Little Fort or where it is, please describe.
Well, people always say if you blink, you miss it. And it's kind of between Barrier and Clearwater. About an hour, I guess, north of Kamloops. And it's kind of the junction between Highway 5 and Highway 24.
So how long did you live there?
Population. I lived there until I graduated high school. So my entire life, born and raised. And, it's funny because obviously my parents still live there and my wife's parents live in Clearwater. So we're up and down the North Thompson Valley all the time. And the more you travel around BC, you've definitely seen corridors that have just completely changed. I talk to people that used to kind of grew up in Squamish and other places, and it's just unrecognizable to when they grew up. But interestingly, for the North Thompson Valley, it literally doesn't feel like it's changed at all. So it's kind of a neat thing, I think. And yeah, it's just kind of growing up in a small town like that. It's just, I look back sometimes at the childhood I had, and it's like the old cliche. It's like how things used to be kind of thing compared to my children who growing up in Kamloops as we speak. It was just kind of the traditional small town experience.
It's such a wonderful area. I love driving up and down that corridor. Why do you think it stayed the same?
Well, I think economics, for one, is, there was no, other than Kamloops to the south, there's no bigger town anywhere north of that, right? And there was no, other than maybe Sun Peak, which is still an hour away, there hasn't been any really big developments. And I would say in my lifetime, the economics of small town British Columbia as a parent, there was, I think, 2 or 3 mills in the valley at that time, and now there's none, right? And so the population growth that's occurred in that area has largely been flat and just more retirees. So I would say that's probably the biggest reason. But yeah, to your point, I mean, I remember in my last 2 years of high school, I went to high school in Barrier. That's the thing in Little Fort, other than I did go to like a one-room schoolhouse until I was in grade 3. And then you'd be bused either for Little Fort, you'd be bused to Barrier. I remember my high school teacher, telling us, it was a social studies class, that he had been kind of all over Europe in the gorgeous valleys that you hear about everywhere. And he like said to us, it's like, where you live is as pretty as anywhere you're going to go. And largely I can't believe I even remember that, but it stuck with me because I've traveled extensively and I never feel sad when I'm coming home. So it's a pretty cool feeling, I think.
What do people do there?
Well, there's literally no industry there. So it's people kind of would be driving to Barrier or Clearwater for work. For myself, my dad, started a small business, a seasonal small business. He opened a fishing store there. He just sold it and retired last year. And last spring was his, I think, 30-something years he had it going. And yeah, most people would be kind of driving to Clearwater, Barrier, working various jobs. My mom was a social worker, so she was worked for the government.
So clearly, with your dad owning a fishing store, you would have grown up in a fishing family, and presumably that's where you developed your love for fishing, because much of the recreation activity in the area would be outdoors related.
Yeah, totally. But it's kind of it's one of kind of those full circle stories, really, because I wasn't necessarily like I would fish with my dad, obviously, but was never really an avid, angler when I was younger. That being said, like me and my friends from Little Fort, we would kind of ride our bikes and go fishing and stuff like that. But definitely, I would say I wasn't very avid when I was in my teenage years. I would go fishing with my dad sometimes for sure, but definitely not like every week or anything like that. And then actually by the time I kind of jumping ahead, by the time I was in later teenage years and in my 20s, I worked in silviculture and forestry. So in the summers and stuff, you have weekends off and you don't want to go back out in the bush. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s and, I'd fish with my dad the odd time, but I met another gentleman was a friend of my wife's best friend. And it was kind of the old story like, oh, he has a fly rod. Why don't you take him out fishing? And kind of eye roll like, oh God, I have to take out kind of a newbie. But he was kind of a quick fishing addict and kind of rubbed off on me. And it all kind of spiraled from there and just laughed because it's kind of a full circle. I never thought I'd work in the fishing industry or anything like that either. And it just kind of came full circle that maybe it was kind of in my blood and DNA, and it was just a bit of a delayed onset of addiction and turned into my career. So that's kind of jumping ahead quickly, but yeah, I wouldn't
Yeah.
I wouldn't describe myself as like a lifelong avid angler. It was kind of kind of came back to me later in life, so to speak.
So before we get into your present role and how you got there, did you do other things of interest when you were growing up in Little Fort? Did you do dirt biking or were you into
Mostly
skiing or
sports, yeah. Snowboarding a bit. I was into hockey, right, rep hockey right through until, I graduated high school. And then post high school, a mix of traveling, really enjoyed traveling. I spent a lot of time in my 20s, kind of on and off, partially living in Central America and kind of touring Latin America and stuff like that. Definitely kind of, the usual hockey and softball and things like that.
You kept a place in Central America up until fairly recently, I think around the COVID period, did you not?
Yeah, so, you know, another kind of I guess this is kind of a, thing about your upbringing. I always traveled when I was a kid. My parents would take me everywhere. Since my dad's business was seasonal, so it was closed down in the winters. Doesn't particularly love the winters. When we were growing up, we would, in early times, we would drive to the Baja, like many people did back in the day in Mexico. And then I believe when I was around 13, my parents went to Central America to visit some friends that were down there and fell in love with an island off the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. And it just kind of spiraled. And that's where we ended up going for the next 20 plus years of our lives, was going down there. My dad started kind of guiding down there and helped a American couple set up kind of a lodge. And he would go down and bring guests and guide fishing. And then when that kind of ended, I was kind of in my graduating or just graduating university, and I went down and kind of built a cabin down there on some friends' land, and yeah, that was a lot of my early kind of career after I graduate was trying to find jobs that early days of working remotely so that I could, spend 3 months of the year living on a tropical island, kind of the classic escapism that young men look for, I guess, and then
Well, in
life
today's
eventually catch
society,
yeah.
you can do that, or a lot of positions lend itself to being able to work from home or virtually or wherever you are in the world. So I can see why you wanted to
Yeah, and I'd
pursue
say
that.
my current position is very similar, but, life catches up to you in terms of kids and their obligations.
Indeed. So you are the father of a couple of sons. Are they into fishing like you are and their grandfather?
Interestingly, about as much as I was when I was a kid.
Hmm.
No, not yet, and I feel guilty about that because I don't push them to go, and it's the kinda case, like, if they don't show interest, then I'm not gonna, like, drag them along by any means, and 2, I guess anybody fishing's kind of means a different pastime to everyone. A lot of people do it for the social aspect, and which I love, going with friends, but it's also, like, something that I do to just kinda get away and escape as well. Escape, the chaos of family life. But that being said, they're now 10 and 13, And this past summer, they started kind of showing an interest on their own. So we'll see where it goes. Who knows? Maybe they'll be into it, maybe they won't, or maybe they'll decide they're into it later in life. But they've been exposed to it enough that it's kind of balls in their court at this point.
What about your wife? Does she fish?
No, not at all. That being said, when we would spend so much time in Nicaragua on Little Corn Island, we had a small boat there, and she would come out and, just for the boat ride and stuff, and she would always catch classic story, like, always catch more fish than me, catch different fish that I
The
had never
least
caught before.
experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, and would just be like, see how excited I was about, "Oh, that species, I've never caught it." And it happened to be that she would kind of do that every time she went out, that she was like, "Well, I kinda caught them all now," and she was I was just like, she would kinda get bored with it. But, yeah, so she was kind of a natural, but absolutely, she doesn't it's not really her interest at all, that's for sure.
This might be a hard question to answer because you have to be sensitive to all the members of your organization. It's a bit like asking who your favorite kid is, but do you have a favorite place to fish? And how often do you fish?
Well, that's a more even controversial question of how often I fish. I gotta guard that one because I do have to work as well. It totally varies, like on the season, to be honest, and that's what I love about BC and why it's such an amazing destination for angling. Is it's just there's so much diversity. I would say definitely when I was younger, and even back to when I fished with my dad, I would never go fish lakes with him. I'd only want to fish rivers. It's just naturally more exciting. There's a lot
Hmm.
more going on. It's a bit more technical. And so I would say that most of my life I've been more into rivers, but this is the classic case of as you get older, you're looking for different experiences. And I would say I fish lakes way more than rivers, probably in the last 4 or 5 years. And just for various reasons, it's the type of fishing that I do. It can be quite addictive. It's very technical, and I'm just kind of in a rabbit hole. But it's pretty common for anglers to have this arc, so to speak, of their angling careers. It's pretty cliche in a lot of ways, but they say, when you're first getting into it, you're all about kind of learning the sport and catching as many fish as you can. And then you get into a phase where you want to catch the biggest fish that you can. And then you kind of level out where it's like you just go and enjoy the experience and take in kind of because you've already, conquered that or got over those addictions to catch more and bigger fish that you kind of get into the phase where you're just happy to go fishing and enjoying the surroundings. But in terms of, I can't pinpoint a favorite destination. I've been very fortunate to be able to do a lot of freshwater fishing and now more recently some saltwater fishing. And I would say the saltwater fishing, enjoy the scenery just because I'm based in Kamloops, right? It's kind of a unique thing to be on the coast and see
Yes.
whales and orcas and all this stuff. But this past fall, I had my opportunity to do my first steelheading trip, and we flew into a remote lodge on the up north of Smithers. A colleague of mine and friend has been running a lodge up there on the Saskatchewan River for the past 2 seasons. It's a First Nations purchased a lodge and are running it at, same as normal, like a steelhead lodge. And so I got to go in there for a full week because it's a fly in, fly out, and did my first steelheading trip. And I was able to actually bring my dad along. He goes steelhead fishing quite a bit and has always been trying to drag me up, and I just have never gone. So that was the most memorable trip on the top of my head at the moment. It's just really remote. I caught my first two steelhead. It wasn't easy. It took like 5 days to get my first fish. So it was kind of a rewarding thing. I had to work for it, but that was the most memorable one on the top of my head at the moment.
Well, how cool is that? And when I think about how you described your experience, that's what people pay a lot of money for to come to British Columbia for recreational fishing. And that's really why the fishing sector, whether it's tidal waters or non-tidal waters, is so popular in this province.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, you can spend a whole bunch of money to go to these amazing remote places, or you can drive your own vehicle. And British Columbians, it's just like anything we have here, right? You take for granted the beauty and bounty of this province because it's in our backyard. And when people from around the world come and are like blown away, you're like, oh, you see it through their eyes. You're like, oh yeah, I look at that mountain every day or whatever. And it's the same thing. I mean, in Kamloops here, I'm kind of blessed that within 30, 40 minutes, I can go fish kind of any direction, any lake I want. And people come from far as California to fish with angling guides here, and they take them to local lakes that I might not even go to because I'm trying to fish a better one, and they consider it kind of world class. So it's all
Mm.
perspective, right? And so you could say that for any sector in the tourism, whether it was skiing, mountain biking, or whatever. We're absolutely spoiled with what we have here. That's for sure.
You're 100% right on that. So, what was your career trajectory to lead you to becoming the head of BC Fishing Tourism Association?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So I graduated university. I graduated from Kamloops, from Thompson Rivers University. It was for my first 3 years, I guess it was called University College of the Caribou or Caribou College. And my last year, I think, and a half before I graduated, they changed the name. That's when it became full university status, Thompson Rivers University. So I graduated there with my marketing and economics degree. I did a study abroad in England, actually studying sports economics as well. And after kind of my first gig after kind of university, after doing some traveling, and like I said, for a good for the first number of years, I was just going to Nicaragua and trying to, working in the summers still for my father-in-law in silviculture, making a bunch of money and just trying to dabble to see what I wanted to do and find something that I could do remotely from a desert island. And one of my first contracts actually was with Tourism Wells Gray, and I kind of was doing some work for them. So that would be, I'd say, it was probably my first tourism job, other than maybe working in my dad's fly shop. And probably I think it was for maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years after I graduated, I was doing kind of private contract work, so website development and some marketing like that. And I would say, it was a mix of First Nations and municipalities and stuff I was working for and private businesses. And then, of course, life catches up to you. And my wife got pregnant with our first child, got married and then got pregnant with her first child. And it was like, okay, well, we need to top up or make a bit more money. I remember at that time I was, pretty guarded still of wanting to. I never I never envisioned myself sitting in an office and doing that
Mm.
9 to 5. It just once you kind of work contract base and you're your own boss. So I always figured I would be an entrepreneur of some regard, right? But I also found it challenging. It's not easy being a contractor and trying to line up clients. And so when I was looking in Kamloops at that time, I was just kind of like, I just couldn't envision what I would want to do. There was no jobs that jumped out at me, none that had super flexibility. And it was around this exact same time that I had got kind of really avid back into fishing. Like literally kind of all just happened serendipitously. And just one day I saw the ad for BC Fishing Tourism, or at the time, BC Fishing Resorts and Outfitters Association, looking for someone to help part time with their marketing. So, basically everything they were looking for was kind of, I had pieced together the experience through my career. So I was like, oh, this is kind of a perfect job. And it kind of took a while to line that up, just because as they were non for profit. It took quite a while to kind of, the association was being run by the board of directors at that point, right? So
Mm.
everything took a little while to get going. So I remember I started off just part-time running their marketing, and I liked it that way because when they hired me, I said, I still have my clients privately and I still want to do my business. But within 6 months, I guess they had saw that I had kind of the passion for it, and they said, well, really, we need an executive director. Because right now, when I started off, it was just me running the marketing, and they had like a office admin person. They had had an executive director in the past, but had been in kind of coasting along for a while with just an admin person and the board doing most of the, like, a working board, which, as you know, it's not exactly the recipe for long-term success of having your board of directors run the association, because all the board was business owners. So it's
Volunteers.
very,
Yeah.
yeah, volunteer, seasonal. So yeah, I think within 6 months, they had kind of added some responsibility. But at the end of the day, it was still part-time, a small organization. There wasn't a ton of money there. I think over the next number of years, I basically built it into a full-time position. And that was largely a mix of the marketing opportunities expanding with funding from Destination BC and yeah, just building the association a bit. So yeah, it was kind of a full circle moment of, just at the right time and right place in terms of being interested in fishing again. If I hadn't kind of reconnected and rediscovered my passion for fishing, I don't think that ad would have caught my eye and it would have been
Mm.
necessarily something. So it's kind of one of those laughable moments when I sit with my dad now that I may have said, like, probably at some point I probably told him there's no way in hell that I was ever gonna be in the fishing industry. And here I
And
am.
here you are.
And it's been a good, I mean, it's probably obviously helped me and my dad's relationship as well. We have something to kind of bond over again. And yeah, so it's interesting.
You never wanted to take over his store?
No, he asked me a lot of times. Like I said, I never wanted to do that kind of 9 to 5 sitting in an office. Definitely sitting 9 to 5 in a retail. No, wasn't something. I got my taste of that when I was, a teenager working in the shops. It was never. He definitely brought it up a number of times, but luckily he found an owner that was going to keep it operating because at some point he was potentially just going to close it and sell it as the real estate. We were out of the family and stuff. Like, you have a business for 30 years, you want to see it continue, right?
Yes.
And so luckily he's got someone continuing it. And it's kind of like a staple of the community in terms of people that travel to Fishing Highway 24. You talk to anybody, oh, Little Fort, oh, they have a great fly shop there. Or if they're coming fishing in the area, it was kind of kind of a staple of the Fishing Highway 24. So yeah, we're glad to see it that it continues and as a new owner with keep it going for hopefully another 30.
Yeah, good to hear. Back to Fishing Tourism Association. What does it do? Who are your members? What are you responsible for?
Yeah, so it's a non-for-profit industry association, represents roughly about 150 resorts and angling guides. The association changed her name from the Resorts and Outfitters Association to the Fishing Tourism Association to kind of open it up so it didn't pigeonhole us just into resorts and guides. But currently, it's primarily made up of freshwater resorts and angling guides. The tidal waters operators, so the salmon lodges and charter operators, they have their own kind of organization, which we work closely with on the marketing side. But yeah, so about 150 members. They all kind of pay their membership dues. Primarily, I kind of wear two hats. Definitely kind of running the association, advocacy, dealing with that kind of the actual association side. But about 80% of my time is actually running the Fishing BC marketing campaign. So just like when I was hired, right? It was just for the marketing purposes. And so that's the part that I've really built over the years is the Fishing BC side, which is a provincial campaign involving, the tidal water, our stakeholders, the Sport Fishing Institute, Freshwater Fisheries Society, obviously Destination British Columbia and their co-op program. And then, you know, as in destinations and subregions that have recognized that fishing tourism is a key driver for their tourism economies, and they'll kind of buy in. It's a match funding situation with Destination BC. So kind of wear two hats. They blend in the middle, right? Obviously, as you can't promote and market an area or a province without doing the work with the advocacy side, and especially a sector like fishing that's dealing with the various levels of government in terms of ministries. Then you're talking about the Wildlife Act and sustainability. And so there's definitely the marketing and the advocacy side go hand in hand, as you know.
My guest on TIABC's Voice of Tourism podcast is Matt Jennings, Executive Director of the BC Fishing Tourism Association. So you referenced advocacy. I think when we first got to know each other, forgive me if this is incorrect, but it seemed to me your time spent on advocacy at that time was about 80%, with 20% marketing. It's kind of flipped, partially out of necessity and what your members expect from you and where your funding comes from, etc. But having said that, I know you're still deep into advocacy. You're very passionate about the sector. And as I've always said, The fishing file is probably the most complex. Because of all the players, it involves the federal and provincial government. There seem to be endless regulations. When you think about what you have to do from an advocacy perspective, I'm sure sometimes it's a daunting task. But what would be the top issues, say top 3 issues that you face every day that you're getting some pressure on from different members and stakeholders?
Yeah. I mean, the advocacy side, when you look at the fishing tourism sector in as a whole, is very complex, like you said, because you have tidal waters and freshwaters, which we're blessed to have in British Columbia, obviously adds to our the product we have. The federal fisheries, so anything taking place in tidal waters and especially obviously involving salmon and ground fish, that's regulated by the federal government. And largely, I that's the role side of the file that the Sports Fishing Institute handles, and it's really, really complex. I have great respect for the work that my colleague Owen Bird and his colleagues do because it's dealing with a federal government and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is a huge task. Like, I was talking to him yesterday, and he's down in Washington for negotiations with the U.S. and stuff around allocation. It's just like so. Largely, the really complex that side of the file is his handling. Since most of my stakeholders are freshwater, that I'm mostly dealing with the provincial government, which is a little bit easier. There's still super complex issues, but at least it's a bit more accessible, I'd say, than the federal government. The top issues I think that I see, and you'll relate to this, is ongoing. That in my entire career and probably your entire career, it's been the same thing. It's definitely land use, around crown tenures. So less than when I started or back in the day, but around 30% of my stakeholders have some form of crown lease tenure. And that could be something like their whole lodge is on a crown lease, or it could be
Yes.
something as small as they have a dock, a foreshore lease, or something even small like a remote camp that they might fly into or something, right? That's could be literally tents. So dealing with that is top of mind for my stakeholders. And it comes down to, in the past 20 or 30 years is the cost, the appreciation of land, right? So it's not even just securing long-term tenures, it's the cost of them. So back in the day, the government would sell parcels at various times when it came up and people would buy them. But a lot of people are like, well, my lease is so cheap. Why would I lock myself in? And then all of a sudden, 20 years later, their
Darn.
their their leases have quadrupled more just because the way BC assessments assess waterfront property, and it's based on a percentage of that, right? So I would say definitely working with government, and obviously the elephant in the room is First Nations issues, regardless, about land rights and whatnot. That the government just basically anything that's a so-called crown land, they are not in a position to be negotiating sale of that, and they haven't been for 15 years, basically my whole career. When I came on, it was like 1 year, a resort was like, "Yep, come up with the money." The next year, they went back and it's like, "Sorry, can't sell it." So that's probably one of the biggest issues. And that kind of dovetails into affordability. Let's be very honest here. There's not any new fishing resorts being built and turned into fishing resorts. We're losing them. Less so probably in the 90s, it really accelerated. I think when the first big wave of property increases, families ended up selling. Lots of times there was a number of examples where the people buying it would just turn it private. So maybe 3 or 4 businessmen or a extended family would buy this small fishing resort in the interior and just turn it into their own, affordable getaway. So we definitely, it's catch 22 because I got to look at everything from the big picture of the overall sector and its viability. That was not necessarily a bad thing for the individual resort that stuck it out, because all of a sudden 2 or 3 resorts around them shut. Those clients that still wanted access to that experience would the business was good for them. But overall, it's not good for the sector. Similar to, I think, my colleagues in the campground space, right? Around the same time as when a lot of the private campgrounds started kind of selling leased lots and stuff. And so that would definitely would be a big issue. Kind of more on the fishing regulation side, definitely around access. I steal this from my saltwater colleagues, access and opportunity. It's like businesses, tourism, fishing tourism business need access and opportunity. They don't necessarily need, the quota of a huge chunk of fish. They need access to them and selling the opportunity to the guests that they're going to have a chance to catch fish, right? And so really working on behalf of our stakeholders, making sure that guided anglers have access to various rivers and closures, obviously. If a province or the feds shut down the opportunity to catch any fish because runs are depleted or whatever, those people go out of business. It's just that simple. If you don't have access to the fisheries, you don't have a business anymore. So that's kind of what keeps you going as an advocate is, the reality is, and I love explaining this, is the fishing sector is made up of owner operator businesses. So, on the saltwater side, there might be some bigger operations, absolutely. But for the vast majority, these are owner operator businesses. I hate the word mom and pop, but that's the reality, family owned businesses. So, when they're having to see their livelihood, that they might be multiple generations that have owned these businesses, you really feel motivated to go to bat for them. And that's kind of what keeps your passion going, right? It definitely and it kind of ties back to the passion for rural tourism in the province. That's what rural tourism is in the province, right? It's just a whole bunch of, you look at the map, it's a whole bunch of small owner operator businesses. And I always describe my stakeholders as being kind of pioneers. Fishing tourism was there with kind of hunting as one of the absolute first tourism businesses that drew people to these remote places in the province, right? And so the problem with that, though, is they're very self-reliant. So in a sector association, you've got to really pry them to engage sometimes because they're used to doing everything for themselves and not relying on anybody, right? And so kind of encouraging them that, hey, there's other organizations, whether it's ours or TIABC, that are here to help when they're used to doing everything for themselves. So yeah, it's an interesting stakeholder base.
It is indeed, and I've met many of them at your regular summits over the years, and I always refer to them as real British Columbians, and that's no disrespect to anybody in the major centers or anybody else that I meet, but these are people that rely on the land, live off the land, love the land, sustain the land, earn their living, raise their families. They know what it's like to be on a great high when business is good, to be on a low when the fishing's troublesome, etc. So I always just refer to them as real British Columbians. They're doing what they love to do, but they care so deeply about what it is that they do for a living, but what it is that their sector represents to the province.
Yeah, I think they're in passion too because they're in some of the most remote places and they have generations of clients coming back, right? The bread and butter of our industry and a number of other tourism sectors is the people repeat clientele. And so, you know, the backbone of a lot of these fish camps is what they used to be called back in the day, is it was like you would come because your grandpa came and
Yes,
his grandpa came. There's a lot of history there. You know, businesses change hands and they have to reinvent themselves, which is always amazing too. You have a new couple or new family take over an old kind of maybe worn down resort and totally replenish it and find a new clientele. It's always fascinating to see the ingenuity of people and how things change over time. So I definitely say like, a lot of our resorts have definitely expanded beyond just being a fish camp. They're
sure.
more, lakeside retreat, and they offer much more experiences than just fishing now. But yeah, and I think, this was the sad part about when we saw a bunch of resorts close is you got to think, you look around lakefront property, it's like my generation, it's almost like you have to inherit it now with the price, right? But what a resort or a campground does, it gives access to everyone to that resource and that experience. Whereas if they shut down and some lakes literally don't have a resort on them, for instance, that used to, and now no one has access to that lake, if there's no rec site and trails campground on it, that whole lake, all the lakefront access might be private landowners now, other than maybe a boat launch, right? And so that's not really accessible to all British Columbians like it's meant to be. So, even though they're tourism businesses, they're providing affordable access that, might not be there unless you were fortunate enough to inherit a lakefront cottage or whatever. So it's an important piece that we want to see maintained for generations.
You mentioned a number of issues as a part of this conversation, whether it's tenures and access, the cost now of land and running resorts. You mentioned businesses or individuals buying these resorts and shutting them down. You referenced also the issues around First Nations, and it's not the First Nations themselves. It's really how government is managing the implementation of DRIPA. Are you fearful for the recreational fishing sector, for fishing tourism in the province? Notwithstanding, there are periods where there are no fish, and that's a whole nother issue on its own. But does it ever keep you up at night that what is happening in the fishing sector, or are you bullish about the future?
Bullish. I'm bullish for sure because in regards to First Nations, like you said, it's largely not necessarily conflict with the First Nations itself. It's how government's handling of it, right? And I think that's going to find its path. But why I'm bullish is when we're talking about rural tourism, what I'm seeing is First Nations communities getting organized in terms of their economic development. And the first thing they're doing is looking in their backyard at what opportunities are there. And guess what? Tourism businesses are still there. The mills have left largely. The resource industry is fleeting. There might be some opportunities left if they get some tree licenses or whatever. But the tourism businesses are there. And the fishing tourism operations are in every corner of this province.
Mm.
And so what we are seeing both on the tidal and freshwater side is First Nations deciding to purchase and keep these resorts going for the most part. So that's why I'm bullish. Um, and because the reality is fishing tourism is very sustainable, especially with, you know, the freshwater side, a lot of the opportunities that we participate in on the lakes, they're stocked lakes, which are paid for by license holders. It's a system that's a little bit at arm's reach of government in a way, with the Freshwater Fisheries Society raising the fish. That's where your license dollars go. So that's extremely sustainable. The wild fisheries, yes, they have their issues, but there's very few that have fully closed down. And I just think on that side of things, when various groups like a First Nation will look at, okay, what opportunities are here and what versus a commercial fishery, for instance, it's much more sustainable, you know, per fish, the revenue generated from a sports fishing venture versus selling at bulk for food. The economics are just all of them point to being the sport fishery and recreational fishing being the answer. And so that's why I'm bullish. And two, the reason I'm so bullish is, like I said, the diversity of experiences we have here. So even in the worst years, when we had a bad wildfire in the Caribou, or a tough run up in the Skeena, or warm, hot drought weather in the Kootenays, there's still dozens of other options for visitors to come and find a fishery that is open. So as certain things get headlines and doom and gloom, but we're diversified. We have opportunities every nook and cranny of the province. So if there's an issue in one particular area, there's a dozen other options for visitors. So yeah. And what would keep me up at night, if I was to be honest, is like if something terrible was happening in one specific area and I personally knew those operators and knew they're already running a seasonal business. And if you see with wildfires and they have to close down for a month or something. It's like a lost season. It's like
Sure.
they're not going to be able to make that up in that particular season. And what we saw, with wildfires, for instance, like it might take a couple of years. Or what we saw with COVID, largely our stakeholders did really well, but the ones who relied on international travel, they just pushed those reservations down the road. And so it took like, even though after the borders opened and all that stuff, it took a couple of years for them to get old bookings off their books. So
Yes.
that would be what keeps me up at night, is knowing that those individual operators are really struggling, and knowing kind of how passionate, and it's a lifestyle business in a lot of ways. It's not like they're making millions of dollars off these operations. So
Do you ever foresee a time where the province takes sole responsibility for the fishery, both the freshwater and tidal water?
no, it's
Would it
just
be a good idea?
no. I don't know. I don't know whether what I see as a good idea is what the province did, I don't know, 20 plus years ago, and remove some of the responsibility for certain things outside of government to non for profits. So we're very fortunate. And this is one of the reasons I'm bullish, is sometimes government just needs to realize when they're causing problems versus, solving them. So I believe it was in the 90s when the provincial stocking program used to be in the hands of the government. Wise people at that time saw the ebbs and flows of government cutbacks and decided, you know what? This would probably be better run in a non for profit. And instead of license revenues going into general revenue and disappearing into the abyss of the treasury, is why don't we link all license sales and some surcharges or whatever? And that goes into a fund, and that funds this non for profit to deliver services on behalf of these anglers. And that's the type of model. I believe they're trying to do that on the federal side, the Sports Fishing Institute as well. It's the model. I mean, it's not perfect. There's things like inflation. So our licenses in British Columbia are extremely cheap, right? So if you don't adjust those licenses for inflation, the costs go up, and for raising those fish and running these programs, and it's not sustainable. But in general, it's way better than having it run by the province. We're in a situation now with the ebbs and flows is staff cuts, and stuff just doesn't get done because there's not enough staff, because there's been cutbacks. And I think, you've heard it a million times, the Fish and Wildlife file. The BC Wildlife Federation has done a great job on that, on advocating for this. But when you look at nearby jurisdictions of how much they invest in their fish and wildlife management, compared to like the broadness of BC and how many species we have, it's extremely pathetic. Like what British Columbia invests in managing fish and wildlife and habitat and stuff, it's just such a minuscule amount compared to comparable jurisdictions around North America or globally. So I'm a big advocate for that kind of model. That's like, you know what? And I think government would be, in private conversations, they'd be the first to admit it. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, we're probably not the best at service delivery.
And yet, there's such good work being done by the BC Wildlife Federation, Pacific Salmon Foundation, Freshwater Fisheries Society, the Sport Fishing Institute, yourselves. There's so many partners that are working in the fishing sector that are doing really good work, restocking lakes, finding ways to rejuvenate rivers, making sure the fish stocks are healthy, reclaiming some lost land that has been perhaps abused, if I can say that, by either people or extraction or what have you. And that's what encourages me when I am exposed to that, as I have been at your summit and through various other channels. I'm really encouraged to see the good work that people are doing.
Yeah, and I mean, we're here talking about the fishing sector, but as you know, under your banner in TIABC, there's a bunch of other sector associations, whether it's mountain biking, is a good example of, there is great, I feel like tourism is very fortunate that people are passionate about, especially in the sector
Yes.
space that's linked to an activity. That kudos to the other organizations and other sports or activities, whatever you want to call them. There is great work being done across the board. And I agree with you, when we do our summit and you just see presentations from some of these other organizations and the work they're doing, like It's pretty impressive. And I think it speaks to what I was saying. You leave it in the hands of good people and good organizations to do some of this work and take it out of the bureaucracy, and good things happen. And maybe the government should realize this. I'm sure they do, but maybe they should just stick to a certain role and let kind of the passionate non-for-profits enable them. So obviously on the marketing side, a lot of the great work I do, it's enabled by Destination BC, Crown Corporation, designating funding instead of them doing all the work, enabling sector and destination marketing organizations to do that work. And I think it's proven. The results are proven.
Matt, we're going to leave it there, but I want you to make me a promise, and that is when I step away from my role, that when I call you, you'll take me to one or two of your favorite fishing spots and truly teach me how to fly fish. It's something I'm looking forward to. I've had a brand new rod for 20 years that has yet to be used, and I may need to get outfitted at Little Fort and support the little business there, but I look forward to some days on the river or on one of the beautiful lakes in British Columbia.
Well, Walt, it would be my absolute honor and pleasure to do it. I'd be really repaying a favor because I've learned so much from you on the advocacy side, your demeanor. So kudos to you. Hats off to you on your tenure. It's been enjoyable as a younger fella coming up. The amount of people retiring now, I guess I've been around for a few days now, but it's been an honor to witness your work and a pleasure to be your colleague.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And it's been my pleasure to work with you. I've learned a lot from you. I did again today, so I want to thank you. It's great fun talking about fishing. And as you mentioned, in spite of the challenges, it's a sector that is thriving for the most part and will continue to be one of those wonderful experiences that not only locals can have, but visitors from all over the globe pay to come here to British Columbia to experience recreational fishing in all its splendor.
Yeah, and I encourage everyone, even if you didn't grow up fishing or maybe casually, it's never too early to start or get your kids into it. Affordable family activity. There's lots of ways. Society runs a Learn to Fish program in urban areas too. So yeah, just pick up a rod and you just never know. You never know when it'll hook you, so to speak, and become a lifelong angler. So thanks again, Walt.
I look forward to it. My thanks to Matt Jennings, Executive Director of BC Fishing Tourism, for joining me on TIABC's Voice of Tourism. And thank you for listening. Please share this episode with your professional colleagues and decision makers to help with our advocacy efforts as we seek to build a vibrant, sustainable, and resilient tourism and hospitality industry in British Columbia. Visit our website at tiabc.ca, sign up for our newsletter, become a member of TIABC, or follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to find out more about our next Voice of Tourism podcast. If you have a tourism policy issue within BC that needs attention, please send me a note at wjudas@tiabc.ca. This is Walt Judas bidding you farewell until next time.